Good morning. Welcome to week 7 of organizational behavior management. I've got a couple of chapters we'll go through this week, but first of all, I hope everybody had a very good Thanksgiving and able to celebrate that safely with your families and maybe smaller groups this year, but hope everybody had a good one. We are in week 7 of our 8-week class, and so we'll have 2 chapters this week, and then I'll finish up with a post on Monday with another 2 chapters next week. Before I get started on the PowerPoints for this week, I wanted to mention that I'd like to have a deadline for all work to be in for me for this Sunday, December 6th. By the end of the day is fine. Like to try to get all the papers, all the discussions, everything finished up at that time, quizzes. So if you could try to shoot for that as a deadline. If you think for some reason you're not going to be able to meet that, you might reach out to me and just let me know what the issues are and what time frame you might be looking at. We'll see if we can work with anything on that, okay? So this week, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. This week, we're doing 2 more chapters, and they are chapter 13 and 14. And I will pull chapter 13 up real quick. A couple of interesting chapters. One's on power and politics, and one is on negotiating strategies. And both of these are extremely interesting, and both of them are very relevant, particularly in the days and time frames we're in right now. The definition of power, the capacity that A has to influence the behavior of B so that B acts in accordance with A's wishes. The most important aspect of power is that it is a function of dependence. So as you go through the book and you're looking at the different aspects of power and leadership and things like that, particularly power, is think about in your spheres of influence, who has power over you, whether it be organizationally, maybe it's in a relationship, and then who do you have power and influence over? Now, sometimes, as we'll look through this, power and influence can be a positive thing. It can be a mutually agreed upon thing. Sometimes power can be very coercive, and it can be a non-agreed upon relationship, but one just has so much influence the other, they're able to exert power over them, whether they like it or not. Even in personal relationships, it's not, unfortunately, it's not uncommon to even see in even romantic relationships where one person has an unfair balance of power over the other partner in the relationship. So we have to understand what forms that power take, how they're acted upon, and how that we can act upon them to maybe rebalance the scales one way or the other. Sometimes we may be the individual that has probably an unhealthy level of power over another individual. And it's real easy to fall into that trap, and it's real easy to get comfortable with that. But at times you have to be able to have the emotional intelligence to be able to introspectively look at your relationships and figure out if there's one that does have an unhealthy balance. And if it does, there are ways to fix that, especially if you're the one who has an unhealthy balance over another individual. And even if you're the individual that doesn't have that power, or somebody's acting that upon you, there are ways to influence and change that type of behavior as well. Again, if it's in a relationship and somebody has an unhealthy power imbalance over another individual, the individual that's on the downside of that can try to act upon that and change that dynamic in that relationship, or in worst case scenarios, they can leave that relationship if they feel like there's no way to get that back in equilibrium again. So, formal bases of power. Formal power is based on the individual organizational position. And in an organization of any size, power is necessary. Let's take Newman University. We just hired a new president. Well, for that president to be able to come in and do what she needs to do in an organization, she has to have legitimate power. She has to have power at her means to be able to impact the organization and move it in the directions that she feels like she needs to move it. And some of that can come in the form of coercive power. It complies from fear of the negative results. So that might be getting fired from a job, or it might be negative incentives, demotions, or reductions in pay, or reductions of incentives, things like that. The opposite of that is reward power, which lies due to a desire for positive benefits. If you think of a lot of incentive plans and organizations, there's a lot of reward power out there, whether it be in the sales organization, sometimes even the general organization at large. Promotions could be a form of reward power, raises, things like that. And then legitimate power, again, is from the formal authority to control and use organizational resources. Now, again, the president of Newman University, when she was hired, the board conferred upon her legitimate power. It wasn't hers coming in the door. And someday, if she left the organization, she doesn't take it with her. The board is the ultimate organizational owner of that organization. So they're the ones who confer that power, and they're the ones who can strip that power. Personal bases of power, there's expert and referent. Expert is influence wielded as a result of expertise, special skills, and knowledge, and reference based on the identification with a person who has desirable resources or personal traits. And one of the referent powers we think of is charisma, where people are just drawn to you. You may not have as much power on an organizational level, but people are drawn to you, and you hear the term a lot right now, influencers. On social media and things like that, that's referent power. That's not really an official position. The power comes from the people that value your personal traits and your influence enough that they're willing to follow you. And again, as we've seen, in some instances, that can be taken away as quickly as it was given. As far as expert power, one of the things you're doing right now is trying to get a advanced degree, a professional degree. Well, when you're done with this process and you've got the designation of MBA, and some of you are in dual degree programs, so you may have an MSW and an MBA. Those are two different levels of professional degrees. That gives you, hopefully, expert power. Now, again, I'll just warn everybody, there are people that get through degrees and they skate through them, whether they're bachelor's or master's or whatever, and they come out with less expert power because they don't know their topic as well as they might have had they gone through. So that's why it's important to work hard when you're going through these degree programs. The general dependence postulate, the greater B dependence on A, the more power A has over B. What creates dependence? Importance, scarcity, non-substitutability. Let me give you an example. In my business that I had before we sold it, we were a farm equipment dealer and we were a Case IH dealer. And one of the reasons we wanted to head for the exit ramp and we wanted to sell our business and exit that industry was we felt like that the manufacturer's power over their dealer network had gotten so off balance, and there's such an imbalance that we didn't feel like it was sustainable anymore. And we didn't have any substitutes. There was basically, through a period of about 30 years, we went from having about 15 to 20 manufacturers down to basically two major manufacturers in the ag equipment business, John Deere and Case IH. And so in all of the markets we were in, there were already John Deere dealers, and they were very well heeled and they very well positioned. So we didn't really have anywhere else to go. We felt like it became a very coercive very non-productive relationship. We didn't feel like we were even dealing with rational actors anymore. So really our only avenue to get balance back in that relationship was to leave it. And we felt like it had gotten to be a very abusive relationship. And so we we chose the only avenue we had at that point. We chose to exit and get out of the industry. They did help us get bought out in a good manner, and so we were able to get out in pretty good fashion, and weren't too much worse for the wear. So anyway, those types of things happen in relationships. If you go back 10, 15, 20 years, that had been a very positive relationship, and we had felt like it was very mutually dependent. We felt like there was a good balance of power. We had influence and power over them at times. They had some over us. We felt like it was a decent balance. But over about the last 10 years we were in business with that company, we felt like it had gotten stacked so far the other way that just wasn't sustainable anymore. So just because you have a general power relationship and basis at one point doesn't mean that that can't change. All right, because it can and it does and it will change. So you always have to keep fighting to keep things within an equilibrium, within a positive framework. Power tactics, they're used to translate power bases into specific actions that influence other. And there are 9 influence tactics. Legitimacy, again, that's the legitimate power that you're given from an organization. Rational persuasion, inspirational appeals. You see that with leaders. Consultation, exchange, personal appeals, ingratiation, pressure, coalitions. All of those 9 are used and can be used. And this is where you want to have a full toolbox. If the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? There's that old adage. Well, that's what I would say in terms of influence tactics. You need to be able to have a full toolbox of tactics that you can use at your disposal, because there will be times where pressure is needed. There could be time where inspirational appeals are the best thing. Sometimes ingratiation can be a really valuable tool for you, but mostly you need a basis of legitimacy in most situations. So try to make sure that you've got all of those tactics at your disposal. Influence tactic effectiveness, most effective, rational persuasion, inspirational appeals, consultation. Least effective, pressure. The only thing I would put an asterisk and a caveat on that. Pressure can be a very effective influence tactic. Sometimes, if all else fails in an organization, your last act of getting somebody to move might be pressure. It might be threat of losing their job. It might be threat of a demotion. It might be threat of pay reductions. And so don't underestimate the effectiveness of pressure. Now, again, go back to that. If the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, well, if the only toolbox you have in your tool, or your tool in your toolbox, is just coercion, pressure, things like that, then you tend to manage a certain way. It's very autocratic. It's very, it gets to be a pretty nasty way of managing people. And most people would say that catches up with you over time. And when it finally catches up with you, it gets ugly pretty quick. So I would say the most effective, I would agree, are rational persuasion, inspiration, and consultation. Cultural preferences for power. Individualistic cultures see power in personalized terms and as a legitimate means of advancement or advancing personal ends, engage in more self-enhancement behaviors. If you look at the US right now, I think the United States would be in this camp, very individualistic. If you look at our political environment right now, you look at everything out there. Now, the other side of that spectrum is collectivistic cultures. And if you think about maybe socialist or communist might be on one end of that spectrum, they see power in social terms and as a legitimate means of helping others. Now, there's a lot of that in our culture as well, right? There's nonprofits, there's non-governmental agencies, there's even parts of our democracy and on the left-leaning perspective of our democracy that kind of see things that way. And maybe it could be argued even on the far right side of our democracy with more libertarian things like that. So uh, it isn't really a one size fits all, but I would say right now, if you look at what we celebrate, who we celebrate, we're definitely, I think, in terms of the United States as far as culture, we're much more on the individualistic side of the spectrum, my opinion anyway. Political skill, the ability to influence others and to enhance one's own objective. Um, this gets into a really delicate side of organizations is politics, and we'll be talking about that a little bit here. You can see people that in organizations that tend to be very, very good at politics, that necessarily don't seem to be that effective, or maybe they don't have that much expert power, but they're really good at exerting influence and playing the political games that go with it. So it does get a little controversial. Another form of power in organizations is coercive, and it can come in the form of sexual harassment. This is any unwanted activity of a sexual nature that affects an individual's employment or creates a hostile work environment. This is more predominant in male-dominated societies or male-dominated organizational structures. You saw a real comeuppance in Hollywood recently, home of the casting couch and a lot of coercive tactics that were used predominantly against women in that environment. But you've also seen the scales change, and it flipped back the other way with the hashtag Me Too movement. And so at least now you have organizations, you have more people in organizations thinking much more in terms of harassment of any nature, whether it's sexual, whether it's bullying, whether it's any kind of harassment in organizations. We've got that on our radar screen, and we're thinking and we're talking and we're acting upon those much more than we ever have. Again, political behavior consists of activities that are not required as part of an individual's formal role, but then influence or attempt to influence the distribution of advantages and disadvantages within the organization. And again, I would just challenge everybody to think about politics. If you're going to have an organization with more than 5 to 10 people in that organization, might even be able to argue more than 3 people in an organization, you're going to have politics of some nature. And the larger the organization, the more prevalent politics is going to get. So to just sit there and say the mantra, I'm not ever going to play the political game, you could really be selling your career and yourself very short taking that position. So I do think it's important to acknowledge that politics exists in organizations. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that, again, just like any other thing, this is one tool that you need to have in your toolbox, is to be able to play politics, to be able to be political at times, because if nothing else, if you're not trying to gain influence as much, you can at least keep yourself on an equilibrium or on a level playing field with everybody else, if nothing else. Okay, so politics arises in organizations when you have conflicting interests, limited resources, ambiguity in decision making. So if you don't have real strong top-down autocratic leadership, there gets to be more politics involved in things. And if you have conflicting interests or limited resources, which I think most of us would agree that our organizations are probably fit that bill, and if they don't, they may somewhere down the road, then we're going to have to deal with things, and we're going to have to represent our interests to try to get us our fair share of the resources of an organization. Politicking is a term known for twisting facts to support one's own goals and interests. Lying, deception, alternative facts. I mean, you pick your terms right now. There's a lot of that goes on in organizations and will continue to go on in organizations. Organizational politics may threaten employees. It can decrease job satisfaction, increase anxiety and stress. It can increase turnover, and it can reduce performance. And all of those are very real threats. And so, if you're a manager or a leader of an organization, it's very important that you act upon and keep that at a decent level. Again, if you're leading an organization, you got to understand there's going to be politics in your organization, and people are going to politic you. You have to be able to see it for what it is, but you also have to keep it under control. You need to keep it tamped down, and you need to keep it to where it's not running people, good people, out of your organization or making it difficult for you to attract good people into your organization. Impression management, the process by which individuals attempt to control the impression others form of them. Again, it's easy to say this is a negative. It's easy to get pious and say, well, I don't do that. Well, yeah, we do. And you probably should be. Everybody has an opportunity. What's that old saying? You only have one opportunity to make a good first impression. Well, we all try to make positive impressions upon each other. The thing I would really note currently, though, is social media and impression management. It's the importance of alignment of imaging and messaging. Again, this is the trap that I think a lot of younger professionals and even high school and college age kids are falling into and will not know it until maybe sometimes it's too late, that they're putting too much out there on their social medias. And when they start looking for a job and they try to start manage impressions that people have of them with a good LinkedIn profile, with good professional sites and resumes and things like that, more and more bosses, more and more potential bosses and organizational leaders check people's social media sites. I personally don't like that. I don't think it's fair. We didn't do it with our organization unless there were some really huge red flags, but I think I was very much in the minority. And I didn't feel like we ever got burned too much not doing that. I felt like our employees had a right to a certain amount of privacy, but I do feel like I was in the minority on that. And I don't think most people are playing very fair on that arena. So make sure that you try to, I told my kids all the way through, watch what you're posting. And we'd keep track and try to help watch what they were posting. And they both did a pretty good job of that. But I think it's really crucial. LinkedIn is a really good tool for impression management currently. I'm a firm believer in it. I try to encourage all of my students to get linked up with me on LinkedIn. I feel like I've got a pretty good site, and so they're very welcome to look at my site if they feel like they can gain from that. But look at good LinkedIn sites, look at good things like, and see how people are representing themselves, how they're putting their impressions out there. Those are excellent tools. Again, just make sure that other tools aren't undermining what you're doing on that front. The ethics of behaving politically. What's the utility of engaging and politicking? Manipulating message. How does your utility of engaging in the political behavior balance out any harm it will do to others? Does that political activity conform to standards of equity and justice? We all have to consider these questions at all times, and it's important that we consider these questions because it's not just all harmless. There can be harm done. There can be damage done to people and careers and even families. And so we all have to be very aware that some of this stuff can have consequences. So we have to try to do it as fairly and equitably as we can and try to keep our integrity intact on the other side of it. And this, I won't go into this in too much detail, but the only reason I had it on here was just, I do think it's important for people to think about your political career. We think about that in the terms of professional politicians, but I think you need to think about it if you're in a career track. Say if you're in education or if you're in a particular industry and you may be moving jobs and you may be doing different things like that, or you're trying to advance in your career or your organization that you're in right now, is think about your career politically. Think about it as a political career. Think about where you need to be positioned, how you need to be positioned. Again, this may sound negative to some people, but it's a legitimate reality. You have to do this, and it's important to do this. So enough about that, but just want to challenge you to think about that in some respects. Okay, that is chapter 13. Let me grab chapter 14 real quick. All right. This is on conflict and negotiation. And again, much like conflict, or much like politics, conflict and negotiation is always going to be on the landscape for us. A conflict is a process that begins with one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about, or, and I put in parentheses, or wants. Okay, so you're coming down to competing interests. And again, in any organization of any size, any organization with any kind of constraints on it, which encompasses most organizations, the majority, you're going to have competing interests. There's never going to be enough resources. There's never going to be enough of everything that you need. So you're going to have to compete and show people why it's more important that you get something maybe over somebody else. And that's where conflict arises. Two perspectives on conflict. There's functional and dysfunctional. Functional supports the goals of the group and improves its performance. Dysfunctional hinders group performance. I think many, if not most, of us would perceive our current national political and maybe even state political environments as highly dysfunctional right now. But we do disagree on the fixes. It's interesting to note that while a large majority of people have a very negative impression of Congress, I think only like less than a 10% approval rate, most individuals and most people have an overall positive impression of their district's congressional delegation. So while in general, we think everybody, the whole political scene is bad, we tend to think our politicians are good because they're bringing home the bacon, they're doing things for us. We see them in a positive light because they form that message with all of the money and their activities within their regions. And we also give that same pass to our own political party. We tend to blame the other political party for what's wrong with Washington, D.C. and what's wrong with politics. Types of conflict. There's task conflict, which can be work, content, and goals. There's relationship conflict, which could be your interpersonal relationships. And then there's process conflict, which is how the work is done. And that's what we get into in organizational behavior, and that's what we study and key on the most. Types of conflict, dyadic conflict, that's between two people. Intra-group conflict occurs within a group or team, and intergroup conflict would be conflict within groups or teams. So intra-group conflict would say Newman University has 5 different schools, the business school, education, Catholic studies, those types of things. Well, if we had intergroup, we might have conflict within the business school. If we had intergroup conflict, we might have conflict between the business school and the education and social work school. Okay, so that's the types of conflicts that can occur within organizations. Potential opposition, communication. Barriers exist, too much or too little. And structure of groups, the size, age, diversity, organizational rewards, group dependency, goals, things like that. And then personal variables, personality types, and the emotions within the group. So those are potential forces of conflict. Intentions, decisions to act in a given way. And then there's 5 conflict handling intentions. There's competing, collaborating, avoiding, accommodating, and compromising. And again, I would encourage everybody to have a full toolbox, because at times you may need to use any one of these to handle a conflict. Or you may start out trying to collaborate and you figure out that you don't have legitimacy, or you don't have integrity on the other side of the fence. And so it breaks down and you figure out, okay, we're just going to have to go head to head and we're going to have to compete. And then there may be other times where you just don't feel like the conflict is going to be beneficial, so you just avoid it. And more often than not, we tend to accommodate or compromise. Minimizing counterproductive conflict, recognize when there really is a disagreement, encourage open and frank discussion, have opposing groups pick important issues and work for mutual satisfaction, and then emphasize shared interests. And all of those, again, are good tools to work with managing conflict. Okay, when we get into negotiation, this is a process that occurs when two or more parties decide how to allocate scarce resources. And here's the negotiation process: preparation and planning, defining the ground rules, clarification and justification, bargaining and problem solving, closure and implementation. I would state, and I don't remember if I made a separate slide on this, I don't think I did. I would say there's one missing on that, and I think it's a very important one. And I'll give you an example of how that is important, but that is recognizing and understanding all the parties to the negotiation. And I'll give you an example from my business background. In the farm equipment business, we would sell everything from really large pieces of equipment to small parts and small tractors, everything from under $10 all the way up to $300,000 to $400,000 plus pieces of equipment and everything in between. Well, when it came time to sell the really big equipment, and when I'm talking about stuff that was $100,000 and up, $200,000, $300,000 and up, it would tend to be a really one-on-one process between the salesman and the operator. Sometimes, as an owner, big deals and things, I would even get involved with that. But one thing that we trained our sales force on, and we trained these people really rigorously on this, was to understand who are the parties to that negotiation. Because in farming and farm equipment in the industry, it was very easy to make the mistake of just going out and dealing with the men in a farming operation. The male that was the quote unquote owner, or the man and his son, things like that. But what we encouraged and we really emphasized with our people is to make sure that you involve the wives as well, because many times the wives were the chief financial officers of these operations. Sometimes they were even the operational officers of these operations, just because just assuming that the man was the one who ran everything, the man was the one who made all the decisions, could be a fatal error. And so our people were very good, I felt like, at making sure that we got everybody involved, even the next gens, even the kids. Sometimes dealers would discount the next generation folks, the kids that were coming up in the operation, just speak to the older owners, and that's a fatal flaw as well. Again, I'll give you an example. We had a long-term banking relationship with a bank in Great Bend, Kansas, and the owner of that bank, as my brother and I were coming up into the business, he made the fatal mistake of their bank just dealt with him, just paid attention to him, and pretty much discounted us. Well, the last 35 years of my career, well, the last 25 particularly of my career, I was the CEO of the business, my brother was the president, and my sister-in-law, his wife, was the CFO of our business. Well, for the last 25 years, we were in control of that business, and we would have been another 10 or so years had we not sold it. Well, guess what happened to the bank? They didn't bother to form and build relationships with us, so eventually they were sent packing, and we changed banks with people who had paid closer attention to us and who had built and invested in better relationships with us, the next generation leaders of the business. And my dad totally understood, and he was fine with it. He tried to warn them what they were doing and that they needed to really do it another way, and they just never paid attention to it. So be sure you understand who are the parties to the negotiation. The parties to negotiation is just as simple as this: is anybody that has influence over a decision, especially major influence over a buying decision, over what's going to take place. That is a party to the negotiation, and they should be at the table unless they tell you they don't want them at the table. So simple as that. So that's a big one that's missing in this negotiation process, in my opinion. Negotiation is a social contract, and it really hinges on reputation, relationships. Again, that's what I was just talking about with the relationships, but also that reputation, your integrity, your trustworthiness. It's very important to take care of your reputation, do what you say you're going to do, and don't lie, and don't misrepresent, because if you ever do, your integrity's gone, and it's going to be very tough for you to do business or conduct business with that party again. Another interesting thing is third-party negotiations, mediators, arbitrators, conciliators. These are different things. It wasn't unusual in our business to work with either mediators or arbitrators. Most times it was mediators. If we had I remember one time we had a big conflict with a customer, and there's about probably $80,000 at stake. And so there were 3 different parties associated with it. So one day in Wichita, we went up on the top floor, about a 8-story building, and we spent the day up there, and the 3 parties were in the building that day, and we were all in different conference rooms, and there was a lawyer that sold his services as a third-party mediator or arbitrator. And in this case, it was a mediation. And he just went from room to room to room and talked to all 3 parties. And so we wound up, by the end of that day, it was about an 8 to 9 hour process. And by the end of that day, we had gotten to an agreement, and we made an arrangement. Everybody wrote checks that day, and we decided what was a fair thing. And honestly, I think it was very fair. And I'll tell you, the way I feel like I know that, I think everybody walked out of the building grumbling and not happy. And that's probably a good sign of a good mediation, is everybody's given something up. Everybody feels like they didn't get everything they wanted out of it. But I did feel like, in hindsight, it was probably a perfect mediation, and that lawyer that we hired to do that actually did a very good job. Okay, that is it for chapter 14. And I will stop sharing real quick. Okay, well, that gets us for this week. Chapter 13 and 14, again, both really interesting chapters. I would encourage all of you to dig in and read and pay attention to these chapters. This is really important stuff. So I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Again, the deadline for getting me homework is this coming Sunday night. December 6th, I believe it is, and you've got all day long. You can get them to me at midnight, 2 a.m. if you needed to. I won't be checking my email till the next day anyway. So, but I would like everybody to do that. And then that last week is so that'll be the last week of our class, and I will still do a video post next week at the same time on the final 2 chapters. But okay. Well, that's it for this week, and I hope everybody has a great week. Stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you all.